Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome to our very first episode of Rosie the Reviewer. I'm super excited because we're starting off with a show that's very near and dear to our hearts, Band of Brothers. So we're assuming that most of the people listening to this will be people that know us. And so you probably know that we are super into Band of Brothers. The way we're going to format it is we're going to talk about the first three episodes in this episode, and then we're going to focus on kind of the middle four episodes in the next one, and then the last three in a separate episode.
So should we tell everybody how we met? Or are we just gonna go straight into it?
Yeah, so we have known each other for 20 years, give or take. And we met doing internet nerd stuff back in the day on some message boards. And what a surprise, we're still doing internet nerd stuff, except now we've met each other. I've been to visit you in the Netherlands, and you've been to visit me in Canada. And during the pandemic, I guess, we both sort of fell into watching Band of Brothers at the same time. And it's kind of really nice when there's something that you're super into that you also have a friend who's super into. So the last couple of years have been, us into Band of Brothers, but also other affiliated kind of HBO war properties and other World War II media. And we've kind of branched out in that way. So yeah, it's really exciting to talk about this show that we both love a lot. And I think has made our friendship better.
Yeah, it definitely brought us closer. Like we've watched other stuff together before, but not like Band of Brothers. And I remember I saw Band of Brothers for the first time when I was probably 16 or 15 when it came out. But then I didn't see it for a long time until we started watching it again, and we've seen it many times since.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I watched it for the first time in the fall of 2020, and we didn't talk about it too much. And then the following year, around Remembrance Day, I think we decided we were going to watch it together at the same time. So you would press play on your end, and I would press play on my end, and we would watch the episodes at the same time. And that's, I think, when we both got super into it.
So wait, you hadn't seen it before 2020?
No, so I had seen, and if we're talking about HBO War, I watched The Pacific, maybe not when it aired, but not too long after. I think I watched it in maybe 2011 or 2012. And then I didn't see Band of Brothers at all until I watched it in 2020. So I was fresh.
That's funny to me because you're such a history buff as well.
I
And
know.
you'd never seen it. Like, I think I saw it in high school, actually. I had a really cool history teacher that was like, let's watch some World War II stuff. So I
Yeah.
saw it in school. And then probably with my dad, and then never again until 2020.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. I've always been into history and I have a history degree, and that kind of stuff's always been of interest to me. And in 2019, I actually went on a trip to see a bunch of the Canadian battlefields from World War One and World War Two. But in terms of being into World War Two media, I'd seen a few movies and that kind of stuff, but I never got really invested into it. Really, like Band of Brothers was my jumping off point for being interested in reading a lot of World War II nonfiction and watching movies and all that kind of stuff.
What do you think makes World War II so interesting?
Wow, that's a good question. I think for a lot of us, I mean, certainly speaking for myself, my grandfather was born in 1922 and served in World War II. So as a conflict, it always felt a lot closer to me, I guess, than conflicts throughout history kind of thing. Like it was something where someone that I knew very well had, it happened in their lifetime and they were directly involved and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's really in terms of if you look at, American involvement, Canadian involvement, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm Canadian, obviously, so that's kind of my angle, but it really is kind of the last war where it really felt justified. So I think it really looms large in, at least for North Americans, that it looms large in our imagination, perhaps for that reason as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I do wonder what it is for me. I don't actually know. I think it probably comes from my dad, who has loads of World War II books, all in Dutch. I've never read any of them, but he's always been interested. So I guess it kind of just leaked over into me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a ton of content out there. If you want to get into really any nitpicky thing, like if you're super interested in, Sherman tanks, or you're super interested in this one particular battle or whatever, you can find books and movies and shows and all kinds of stuff on it. It's really one of those things that, because I guess it's captured the imagination so much, there is tons of stuff available on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's so much more World War II stuff than there is World War One stuff as well, which is
Yeah.
I don't know why that is, but maybe it's a more it's a strange thing to say, I guess, but it's a more popular kind of war than World War One is.
Well, I almost feel, because there's only that time span of about, 20-25 years between them, that World War One almost gets overshadowed by World War Two.
Yeah, I don't know much about World War One. I'm gonna say
And I think that's part of it too. I mean, World War One is very complicated. I mean, in kind of the macro sense, it's not. It really was a bunch of countries trying to fight silly wars for imperialist reasons and capitalist reasons and that kind of stuff. But if you actually if you want to learn about the causes of World War One, it's like, well, we got to talk about the Crimean War, and we got to talk about this and that happened in the 19th century, and we got to talk about Alsace-Lorraine, and we got to talk about, and it's just so much. It's kind of hard to dig your hooks in. Whereas like World War II has a very easy narrative to follow.
yes, and I guess maybe there's even more of it that's been documented as well.
Yeah, I mean, probably.
Yeah,
Most people listening will know this, but in case you did not, the show Band of Brothers is actually based on a book of the same name by Stephen Ambrose. And
that's exactly what I was gonna say. So that's good.
oh, well, we're geniuses. We're so smart, and we also potentially wrote some notes down in advance, so that's helpful as well.
But no one can see them, so we're fine.
Yeah, just trust us when we say that they're full of genius galaxy brain material.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
So
so
you've read the book, right?
I have read the book. I read it after I watched the show. I think that this is perhaps, I don't know if I think this is a popular opinion, because this is the opinion held by most of the people that I know who are interested in this kind of thing, but I don't think the book is that good. I think the show as an adaptation is much better than the source material.
Interesting. I'm making it sound like I haven't read the book. I've read the book. I just can't remember the book. So
It's very, in terms of, and I mean, I'll just preface this by saying that I'm not a historian or anything like that, but I have read a lot of historical nonfiction, and I find that the Ambrose book is just really light on corroboration and citation and that kind of stuff. And so essentially, the book is a narrative where he takes down these oral histories from the veterans of Easy Company. And it's very, I think that a lot of the veterans have come out and said, no, this didn't happen in this way, or this is not what I meant, or, this story was told about me, but it's not true. And so a lot of stuff got published that, it's a very colorful account of the lives of these men and their company in World War II, but it's very light on what historians usually enjoy, which is fact checking.
yeah, I think that's something we'll be talking more about when we're discussing Band of Brothers as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so I think the show is a great adaptation of a mediocre book.
That's a hot take right there.
Yeah, you heard it here first. And by first, I mean I'm just reiterating something that a lot of other smart people in this fandom have said.
Yes. All right. So let's get started with the show then.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of do a little recap of each episode that we're talking about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the characters that get a lot of focus in that episode and some kind of personal perspectives and insights.
So let's get started with episode 1. It's called Curry. In this episode, we get to know our characters for the first time as they get ready to jump into Normandy, and we follow them during their training in the legendary Chikora. At the start of the episode, Easy Company is about to jump into Normandy, but their jump gets postponed because there's bad weather, so they can't fly or jump. Then we see a flashback to, I think, 2 years earlier, where we just follow them on their training and where they meet each other for the first time.
Yeah, so I think that probably first and foremost, we should talk about the veteran interviews. So the cool thing about Band of Brothers is that it was made at a time when a lot of the veterans were still around. It aired in 2001. And so they were able to interview a lot of these guys, which is really cool. And so before each episode, we get a little kind of taste of these real guys and their thoughts and opinions and insights on kind of the events of the episode. I think that's really cool. There was one kind of comment that I wanted to pull out. We can't remember who exactly says it, but we're gonna say McClung, and we're gonna stand by that, even though we might be wrong. But he says something about how this wasn't like Korea or Vietnam. We were attacked, and I thought it was just so fascinating that he said that. It's just so interesting how there's this kind of need, I think, sometimes to, if you look at kind of American history over the last 80 or 100 years, this is kind of the conflict that really felt, justified, and everyone can follow this narrative of there was a good guy and a bad guy, and we had to go to war because we were attacked after Pearl Harbor and that kind of stuff. So I just thought that was really interesting. Every time I hear that comment, I'm like, wow, you know what?
It's also really interesting to me when I think about it that the Americans and the Canadians and even some other people are fighting a war on a continent that's not theirs. Like, it's not their war.
Yeah. So this is kind of interesting. Well, maybe not interesting for anyone else, but interesting to me. Sidebar. Canada fought in World War I because we had to, essentially. We're still part of the British Commonwealth. So when Britain declared war, we declared war. But in 1932, they passed the Statute of Westminster, which basically made it so that Canada could decide our own foreign policy. We did go to war in World War II, and I mean, a huge part of that was because Britain was going and the other Commonwealth countries were going, but it was more of a choice at that point.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. I learn something new every day.
And the Americans, I mean, they, even before Pearl Harbor, I think a lot of people saw the writing on the wall. Roosevelt was trying to keep them out of the war, but there was certainly, there were guys who were already starting to enlist and, wanted to potentially serve and this and that. And then when Pearl Harbor happened, it was really kind of the match on the tinderbox.
Yeah. The Allies didn't come into the war until later either, so they've seen what's been going on as well, I think, and then go to this war. But even still, I don't know if I could I couldn't go to war, but if I would go to war for a continent that's not mine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is really interesting too, because so much World War II media, and for obvious reasons probably, centers on the American involvement,
Yes.
and I think so a lot of people kind of know the narrative of the American involvement in World War II, Whereas, a lot of us, obviously, Canadians participated. Obviously, obviously, you guys were heavily involved in the Netherlands. So I
We
think
didn't have
that
much
it's
of a
just
choice, I think.
right, exactly. So it's just interesting. It's obviously Band of Brothers focuses on, and it's actually a tight focus on one company of guys um, fighting for the Americans during World War II. But yeah, there are interesting stories to be told about other countries as well.
Right, maybe we'll do that for another piece of media. The funny thing about these interviews, or funny, we don't know who we're looking at when these interviews start. So you can kind of, once you get further into the series, you'll have an idea of who's who, but you don't know until the very end,
I know. I
which
think it
is
makes it especially extra poignant when you get to the end and you see their names flash up and you go, "Oh, that's this guy and that's that guy," and that kind of thing. So, in this episode, we have obviously a lot of the characters are introduced, but there are some specific kind of really interesting relationships that get set up. And one of the ones that we wanted to talk about was Sobel and Winters, because that's kind of it's interesting. We're in an episode where the guys are not in the war yet, but we still have this conflict that's happening because we have this CO, this commanding officer, who rubs everyone the wrong way, who has a very abrasive leadership style. And so Sobel is, in my opinion, the reason why the first episode is so interesting. And, it does have that conflict and that spark, even though they're not in the war yet.
I agree, and I think they're made out to be very black and white in the show, where Sobo is this jerk. And Winters is kind of the sweet, gentle, quiet opposite of him. But it is
Yeah.
if you read World War II books, you do, and you read about Sobo, apparently he wasn't a very nice person.
Yeah.
No?
I mean, I think it's interesting too. At least in the show, we do get kind of a comment from Nixon saying that, probably Sobel behaving in this way made the company stronger. And I think a lot of the guys kind of agreed with that. So,
Yes.
but yeah, the Sobel Winters relationship is great because we're getting all of this awesome character stuff. We're learning so much about Winters, and it's almost exclusively because of how he reacts to this situation with Sobel that he's been thrown into.
Yes, and it also forces him to kind of step up as a leader, I think.
Yeah,
Like, if Sobo had been a more popular man, Winters would probably not even have become Easy Company's leader.
right. It's true. Yeah, he definitely had to kind of, this is the first instance of him, and we'll obviously talk about this in later episodes, but this is the first instance of him standing up for the guys and having to be that person who puts himself in between them and, an obstacle or whatever.
Right. So, what do you think about this episode as an episode? Do you like it?
I think it's a necessary episode in terms of introducing us to everybody and setting up this situation that they're going into. But I would say it's not my favorite. And I mean, it's going to be really hard for an introductory episode to compete with what we know is coming later, D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge and all that stuff.
It's true. I think it's a necessary episode, like you said, to introduce everyone. But also, I've come to appreciate it more the more I've seen it. Like, I remember the first time watching it, I thought it was a little bit boring. But if you look at it in the perspective of the series as a whole, it becomes a lot more interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, this kind of segs nicely into our next section, but we're kind of getting to see these guys work as a team for the first time and, become these, the famous legendary brothers and Band of Brothers. And we had kind of talked a little bit about Band of Brothers as a piece of media, and to some extent, the other HBO war properties are very popular among women and queer people, which I think is maybe a demographic you might not expect from, a war show, essentially.
Nope.
And I mean, we had talked about this a little bit, but we had kind of touched on part of the reason might be because it's so character driven and it's about the relationships of these characters. And it's just so interesting to see kind of how they interact with each other and that loyalty and that brotherhood and all that stuff.
Yeah, I want to say that even if you're not into World War II history like we are, you might even still enjoy Band of Brothers for being such a character driven show. You might not like the war bit, but the characters are really interesting, and their relationships in the show is what makes the show so good. So it's not the fact that it is about World War II. It's just
Right.
good characters, basically.
Yeah, it's not super technical. It's not I mean, I'm a huge fan of action as a genre. All my favorite movies are action movies, but I'll be the first to admit that oftentimes the relationships are very superficial. You don't really care about the hero and the love interest that much because they're kind of bland and two-dimensional and whatever. And you're there for the car chase or you're there for the explosions or whatever. But in Band of Brothers, you get the best of both worlds, which I really enjoy.
I enjoy that too, and I don't really like action movies. So. Well, that's a lie. I do like action movies, but I won't go and seek them out as much as I would other stuff.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. And I think they kind of knew what they were doing. I mean, obviously they called it Band of Brothers, so they knew that that was going to be kind of an overarching theme. But also with the boot camp situation, how the actors had to go through a boot camp that was sort of similar to what, regular soldiers would go through. And in that sense, they all became bonded off screen as well. And that kind of translates to on screen.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I've met a couple of them. The actors, I mean, I've been on a couple tours with them. And they've recently gone back to Takawa to jump from C-47s to actually earn their jump wings, which I think is really cool. And they're going to jump over Normandy for the 80th anniversary, which I think is even cooler. I
So
could
cool.
never, but it's so cool.
Oh my goodness, me either. I'm not a heights person at all.
And actually, one of my favorite things that I own are my little jump wings that you also own because I gave it to you. So sometimes I bring those with me on tour, but I'm also terrified of losing them. But I don't know, lots of relationships are formed through this series, both for the actors, I think, and for us as fans, which is really cool.
Yeah. No, you're so right. Like the fact that these guys are still so invested in it, 20 odd years later. And yeah, I do have my jump wings that you gave me, and I ran my first marathon the summer after you gave me them, and I pinned them to my little running belt or whatever. So brought them with me.
Oh, like,
Yeah.
I think the next time you go running, it should be up Currahee.
Listen, I would love to run Currahee. It just feels like something I gotta tick off my bucket list one of these days.
I would go with you, except I wouldn't be running.
Well, maybe I'll run it and then we can walk it or something, or vice
Sure,
versa.
we can go walk it very, very slowly. It's fine.
Going into episode 2, which is called Day of Days, and this is our infamous D-Day episode, which I think is probably a big favorite for a lot of watchers of the show. D-Day obviously looms really large in the popular imagination. Everyone talks about storming the beaches of Normandy. This is our episode where we open on essentially the guys getting ready to make the jump. They're in the planes and then they land in Normandy. They end up being scattered all across the peninsula for a number of reasons. And they kind of have to make their way back towards each other and then essentially make it easier for the landing forces on the beach to be able to land and come inland by destroying guns and this, that, and the other thing. So this is also where we get the taking of Breakcourt Manor, which is a pretty kind of big ticket event in this series as well. So this is a pretty action-packed episode. Definitely a lot of combat scenes. But one of the things that I think Band of Brothers does super well is that the combat scenes don't they don't drag on, they're not boring, it's not just noise, like you know who's doing what and why they're doing it and that kind of stuff.
Well, you say that, but then all the men are white guys in camo.
Yeah, we did talk about this thing. This, I mean, and a lot of World War II shows have this problem. All these white guys look the same.
And also, they're like covered in face paint at this point because it's D-Day and they've just done a night jump.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, you're right. And I think that's one of the reasons why the first episode is so crucial because we at least have a hope of recognizing some people.
We get to see their faces at least, and they're not wearing
Yeah.
their helmets yet. So
Yeah. Exactly. In this episode too, we already know Winters, of course, from the first episode, and we really get to kind of see him come into his own as a leader, obviously under fire and under pressure. And he is not supposed to be the leader of Easy Company, but unfortunately, the leader of Easy Company, his plane went down, and so this kind of is a job that gets dropped in Dick Winters' lap. And I mean, it's a very capable lap, but it is still quite the job to take on at the last minute, on D-Day.
pretty amazing. Like, he's actually just, there's no other high ranking officer to be the leader, and he just has to do it. He's got
Yeah.
no choice.
And everyone but him seems very aware of this. Buck brings it up and someone else brings it up, I believe, where they say, oh, well, if Mian doesn't come back, like, isn't it you? And you can tell that this is one of those having greatness thrust upon him situations. This is not maybe what he would have wanted, but he steps up all the same.
And he turns out to be such a good leader as well, which is, I guess that's lucky if he's not meant to be. Like, you can also have a shitty leader, like Sable would have been.
Yeah. Yeah. And we also, speaking of leaders, we do get introduced to Spears in this episode. And obviously, we don't know this yet that he's going to lead Easy Company later on, but we do get quite the character introduction. Essentially, we get the scene where Malarkey believes that Spears has killed all of these German POWs, and the show doesn't quite give us closure on whether or not that actually happened. We kind of overhear it from Malarkey's point of view, and then all the guys are talking about it later, whether it happened or whether it didn't happen, and these rumors are going around. But it's quite the character introduction.
It is. That scene as a whole, even with Malarkey talking to the American German, is also a very interesting way of introducing that particular myth. Like, Malarkey is just kind of connected with someone that would have lived across the street from him or something. And then a few seconds later, you hear gunshot noises, but you don't see anything, so we don't actually know what happened. And that's pretty interesting. And I like that they keep it kind of a mystery.
Yeah. No, I agree. And it obviously ties in later when Spears is talking about how he doesn't discourage those rumors because maybe it's good if the men think that their leader is the biggest badass in the forest, kind of thing.
And he kind of is. So
Right. Yeah, yeah. We also get some fun character development for Wild Bill Garnier in this episode. I think it's really neat, kind of from a storytelling perspective, how he finds out that his brother was killed fighting in Italy. And then throughout the episode, he's kind of reacting to that. So D-Day waits for no man. So he finds out that his brother's been killed, and then he has to go and participate in this conflict. And he disobeys orders from Winters, and he's kind of all over the place. He's arguing with Hall, and we get to see this kind of angry, emotional fallout from what happened, which I think is getting to see men have actual feelings about things that happen. I think this is really, really rich and interesting storytelling stuff.
I feel like Banner Brothers in general doesn't shy away from showing the vulnerable side of being in a war, too. I mean, it is pretty heroic and American at some points, but it's also, you also see men breaking down and you see them reacting in a way that they probably would if they were actually Unlike so many other war movies that are just all about, it's not all about the glory.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean, we were also talking about how this episode and I guess the show in general holds up, 23 years later. And kind of when we were talking about it, we were talking a little bit how like visually it still looks really good. Like the scene where they're jumping out of the planes and stuff, it's still sometimes you watch older media and the fact that that technology has grown in leaps and bounds is really obvious, but it still looks good. But I also think in the sense of how the episode holds up all these years later is that these kind of emotional beats still resonate, and the fact that they like hit those so strongly is what makes this show still interesting to watch.
I agree. And also, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, so just never mind. This is gonna happen more than once on the show, I think.
That's okay. We can circle back. If you think of it later, just yell.
Sure. You were talking about Ho earlier. We should touch briefly upon all the celebrities that are in the show.
Oh my goodness gracious. There are literally so many celebrities in this show. Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, Andrew Scott, obviously, Damian Lewis and Ron Livingston. Who else? Oh, Tom Hardy.
Tom Hardy's in it, yeah. Jimmy Fallon is in it.
Jimmy Fallon is in it. Yep.
And I guess Simon Pegg is in it, and David Swimmer was probably the only one who was already famous at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about it's so interesting because you'll hear interviews with the actors and they talk about how, every young guy in Hollywood wanted to be in Band of Brothers, and it didn't really launch too many careers. Like a lot of these guys, of course, became famous later, but it would be off the backs of other projects. I just think that's interesting.
Yeah, and they were also young at the time. They're all in their late 40s, early 50s now.
Yeah. Yeah, for
Been
sure. The
around.
passage of time, huh? Hell of a thing.
I know. I hate it.
Do you want to talk a little bit about going on tour in Normandy and going to the beaches and that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I've been to Normandy once. I know you've also been. I've been to Normandy once with We Happy Few 506, which is the touring company started by Matt Leach, who plays Talbert in Band of Brothers. And they take all kinds of people on tour, but also the actors join, and you go to visit the locations where Easy Company has been. And we also went to Normandy, so we did go to the beaches. And they try to make it so that you get, on one hand, Band of Brothers, but also just general World War II history, which is really interesting. And the actor on tour for Normandy was the actor who played Donald Hubler. So it was really nice to have him with us over there. And we also got to see the place where Lieutenant Meehan's plane went down, which is in a field somewhere, and it's quite spooky because you can still see the place where his plane crashed because there's no grass there. So it's quite haunting and spooky. Our tour guide took us to that spot and read the last letter that Lieutenant Meehan sent home. And he was so young, I think he was 22 or something at the time, which is really crazy to think about when they're just kids, really, and then they have to lead entire companies into war, which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. I like that the tours they show you what's in Band of Brothers, but they also show you like the broader picture of World War II. So we went to Breaker Manor and we went to St. Mary Cleese, but we also went to other places that were pivotal in the war, but not necessarily in the show. So you get a broader understanding of the war.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah,
Where have you been?
yeah, so when I went, I visited, I was, looking at sort of Canadian perspective. So I went to Juno Beach, which is where the Canadians landed on D-Day. I believe it's called Courcelles-sur-Mer these days, but Juno Beach, you can look that up and you'll also find it. They have actually a really good museum there that is, I'm sure, run by some aspect of the Canadian government. It's so interesting. I spent hours in there reading all the stuff. And right by the door, they have a box where we were there. We happened to be there in July, I believe, and right at the beginning of July. And so they had a box by the door. And essentially, what they would do is the box would be full of however many poppies for however many Canadians had died, like on that day during the invasion. And so you would see like just a box like this full of poppies or this full of poppies, like depending on which day you went. So I thought that was really powerful. And they also had
You can't see my face on this podcast, but I'm kind of pouting.
and they also had a really cool thing. I believe this was at that museum where right at the end they had this scrolling list on a projector of all the Canadians who had died in World War II, and it said
Wow.
something like there are X number of names on this list. It would take X number of hours to scroll through all the names. So that I
Wow.
thought was also really
That's
powerful.
intense. Yeah.
Yeah. And they have a couple of little forts on the beach too, the German fortifications. So that was really cool as well. Yeah, it's a neat place. If you ever get a chance to go to Normandy, I think we both would recommend.
I would like to go again, but not. Last time I was there around D-Day, and it's really busy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm in a wheelchair, so if I go somewhere that's really busy, it becomes really difficult to do stuff. But I
Yeah.
did walk on the beach. I walked on our beach, which was quite nice to do.
Yeah. Well, we'll go in the fall or something one day when nobody's there.
When we do our Band of Brothers trip that we've been talking about for a million years.
Exactly. So moving on to episode 3, Carentan or Carentan, if you want to be, Nixon
French.
about it. Actually, just like slight sidebar, but I think that's one of many little character notes throughout the series that they are sure to kind of slot in there to give you some idea of what the character's like. Nixon saying the French pronunciation of the places is just so indicative of his social class and where he comes from versus the background of all these other guys.
Yes, and then he also does the Dutch pronunciations of the places he goes to in the Netherlands, and it's all wrong.
Yeah, we'll get to that, but Mart has
Sure,
definitely
let's
some
do
commentary
Quarantine
on the
first.
Dutch representation.
Yeah.
So essentially, this episode takes us to it's D-Day plus however many days. So we're getting kind of the period of time after D-Day where the American forces, where the Allied forces are moving inland, and so we see the Battle of Carentan, and it's kind of pivotal role in the Normandy invasion, trying to take these kind of strategic towns and villages to make it easier for the forces on the beach to move inland. So one of the things that we had talked about was how even though they give you the dates of when various things are happening, in terms of the pacing of the show and following the timeline of when things happen, it's a bit difficult to place certain events in time. And so Carentan is roughly a week after D-Day, I believe, just in case anyone's trying to visualize that in their mind.
You know what would also be quite handy if we had it? A map. Just a map.
A map would be great. So I did last night. I watched this episode and I looked up Carentan on a map, and it is a very small, nondescript French town. Sorry, Carentan. Sorry if you live there, but yeah, it wasn't. It didn't look very exciting, but it was. It was kind of in the middle of the little peninsula there.
Yep.
So in this episode, we have our characters, our base characters that we kind of know, and this is really, I think, the first episode where we get to focus on one character. And in this case, it's the character of Albert Blythe, who is a soldier of Easy Company. And we're getting to see his reaction to this continuous combat situation that they're in. They've been in Normandy for a little while now. There's no point where you're really kind of safe and you can turn off. And a lot of the guys haven't even found the company yet, right? Like they've been scattered all over the peninsula. They're fighting with other units. They're trying to find their way back to the guys that they know. And so we get to see the kind of impact of that on, these young guys.
Yeah, that's something that Band of Brothers does more often. Like in other episodes, they pick characters to focus on, which I think really helps from a storytelling perspective, it's really interesting. But Blythe is, you only see him in this episode. It's the only episode he's in. So you get a little glimpse of him and then he's gone.
Yes. Well, I mean, spoilers, but he does get quite egregiously shot in the neck. That's why we don't
Yeah.
see him anymore.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is the episode as well where the episode finishes by saying that he never recovered from his wounds and he died in 1948, and that is simply not true. He died in the 60s, I believe. So
Yeah. It's a little mistake, I guess. But I can kind of forgive the creators of it for this mistake because apparently all the veterans thought he was dead.
yeah, I mean, this is another one of those situations where if you're a historian, you should verify information that is given to you from an oral primary source.
Yes.
But this, I mean, it happened. It's, it is what it is. We also
Yeah.
get to see in this episode, we kind of get a foundation for the character of Don Malarkey. And as the series goes by, I think he's one of those characters that we really get to watch have a really terrible, no good, bad time in the war and how that kind of impacts them. So in this episode, he's still kind of, he's so polite to the woman who does their laundry, and he's picking up the laundry, and she's asking him if he can pick up the laundry for all these guys who, didn't make it back and that kind of stuff. And so we get to see this kind of just like this kind of like innocence, I guess. And so again, he's a character that we watch as time goes on, obviously really suffers.
Yeah. And this episode with Blythe too, it kind of deals with shock and PTSD for the first time as well. Because Blythe gets historical blindness in this episode. And I had to actually look up if this was an actual thing. But apparently it is.
Yeah. I think it's so crazy the way the body reacts to stress, right? You never know what's going to happen. And it has nothing to do with how brave you are, how strong you are, whatever. It's just there's a part of our animal brains that will be like, no,
Nope.
nope, not into this.
Yeah. And it's the first time we see everybody fighting in a town that's still populated. Like there are still people in this town while it's being shelled.
It's so, and we go from the last episode, D-Day, where they're kind of fighting their way through farm country, and now, of course, they're fighting in this town. And it's like so visually interesting. Like all the fight scenes are very different from each other, and they have to be orchestrated in a totally different way. So yeah, I think that's really neat too.
I always somehow forget this episode. I mean, I don't really forget the episode, but I forget where in the story this is. It's one of those, if you ask me what happens exactly in this episode, I won't know.
Yeah, it is a really, I mean, of course it's pivotal to the story, and it's a well done episode, and there are lots of little good character moments in it. But I agree. I think it's tough because it falls between, like, we have D-Day, and then the next episode focuses on Market Garden. So there are these moments that kind of stand out in our mind, and I think for most of us, like Carentan, it's just not one,
Yeah, I think Winters does say in the very beginning why quarantine is important. Like,
Yeah.
he says it very briefly, but as a viewer, I don't think you have any idea of kind of the meaning of quarantine in the whole war. Like, it's like you said, it's a tiny village in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, and that's kind of, we have talked about this before, but the fact that this show has a very tight focus on Easy Company is great for character-driven storytelling, and I think they made the right choice in that regard to have that focus. But it just means that you lose a little bit of that big picture stuff, right? You don't always necessarily know, like, when are we, where are we, why is this important in the grand scheme, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a couple episodes that suffer from the same issue, I think. But they do have little recaps at the very end of the episode, which kind of tell you where Easy Company ends up at the very end of the episode. But for some reason, it doesn't stick. At least not for me. I always just forget
Yeah, and I think as well, I mean, we can follow more or less what Easy Company is doing, but that doesn't necessarily give us the best understanding of what is going on in the war overall, you know?
It's funny. I don't know that I necessarily like. I like World War II and I like knowing what's going on. At the same time, I don't really care because I just want to know if my boys are going to be all right.
Right. Yeah, they really do a good job of making you feel connected to the characters. And speaking of this this is the episode where they introduce Babe, right? Like right at the end.
At the very end, yeah.
Yeah. And Babe is a replacement. So obviously, once men are killed or wounded, they have to be replaced in the company. And so Babe is a new character that gets introduced and becomes a series regular, I guess, becomes kind of a main character.
And a fan favorite, I think, at least
And
for me.
certainly a fan favorite. And I've read the book. So he wrote a book with Bill Garnier. They ended up this scene in this episode is where they meet for the first time. They both are from Philly, so in the same neighborhood.
South Philly, right?
South Philly, yeah. And I read the book that they wrote together because in real life they remained friends for many years, and they of course were involved in the making of Band of Brothers. And they wrote a book together that I thought was, you might not glean any kind of fresh insights from it about the war, but you really got a sense of their camaraderie and their friendship. So I thought that was really cool.
What's it called? Do you know?
It's called Brother in Arms, Best of Friends, or something like that.
I still have to read it. I still haven't read it. You'll learn in this series that I have a lot of books. I just have not read any of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we're all in that boat. But
And I keep buying more books and I'm not reading them.
yeah, that's always the conundrum. I'm like, oh, that book looks great. I have 37 books at home that I need to read. But there are lots of, I mean, a lot of the guys, so generally speaking, a lot of guys who fought in World War II came home and wrote memoirs, and some of them are better than others because obviously if you're not someone who's a writer or familiar with writing anything long form or whatever, I mean, a lot of these guys did team up with actual writers and that kind of thing. But so there's tons of memoirs, World War II memoirs out there, all to say. And especially there are tons of memoirs from guys in Easy Company. So if you want to read about any of these guys, you can. And so I've read the Bill and Babe book, and then you've read the Don Malarkey book, right?
Very good. I really enjoyed it. It reads like fiction, but it's not fiction. It's a very storytelling kind of memoir.
Yeah.
Just that's how I like it.
We have discussed episodes 1 through 3 of Band of Brothers today, and a
That
little
was
bit about
fun.
yeah, it was fun. A little bit about the book it was based on. I feel like I talked a lot. So next episode, everyone help me bully Mart into talking more. Um,
Okay.
so our next episode, we're going to focus on episodes 4 through 7 of Band of Brothers. Some really meaty stuff in there. Very excited to talk about. I think we're both excited to talk about Bastogne. And you know what? Crossers is a great one, and I love the Breaking Point too. So
They're all good.
yes. So we really appreciate you listening. This is a fun little project for us to do, and it's super awesome. If anyone's interested enough to listen to us ramble for an hour or so, we'd love it if you would continue to listen to the next one.
And also, if you have any questions for us that you want us to talk about on air, we can definitely also do that.
Yeah, absolutely. We love the sound of our own voices, so feel free to ask us literally anything. And lastly, just to finish off here, we'll talk about what World War II nonfiction we're reading this week. I just finished Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. She's the same author who wrote Seabiscuit. And there is actually a movie based on Unbroken with Jack McConnell in it, I think. So
Have you
we'll
seen it?
have to. Sorry?
Have you seen it?
No, I haven't watched it yet, but I downloaded it. So we should do an episode on it.
You can't say that on the internet.
I mean, I could have legally downloaded it. You don't know. You don't know. I haven't admitted
Yeah.
to a thing.
Right.
So
Okay.
basically, I obtained the movie Unbroken, and we should do an episode on it. So the book is essentially about it's a true story, of course, and it's about this guy who was an Olympic runner. He competed in, I believe, the 1936 Olympics, and then he became a bombardier in World War II, and he served in the Pacific, and his plane went down, and it's the whole story of how he was on a raft for like 47 days, and then he was captured by the Japanese, and then he went through all these terrible prisoner of war camps, and then he was liberated at the end and went home. And you actually get a ton of interesting stuff about when he went home and his dealing with PTSD and how that affected his relationships and all that stuff. So it was really interesting.
Is it a tough read in terms of language? Like, is it a heavy book to read?
No, I didn't find it was too bad at all. It was interesting. It really I and the guy it's focused on is very like interesting as a person. He was one of those
Okay,
people who was kind of a brat growing up. He was always getting into trouble and was always getting into shenanigans even as an adult. So
right. That sounds like a good recommendation, and I'm gonna be really boring. I've just started Masters of the Air last night, so that's
nice. I
my
have
book.
read I have read Masters of the Air. I read it on vacation a couple years ago because I thought the show was imminently coming out.
And meanwhile, you
um,
haven't even seen the show.
I know I haven't watched the show, but I mean, the book is, I would say, it has a good mix of kind of anecdotal stuff and more kind of macro overview stuff. I do think it's a bit too quick to sort of gloss over or apologize for like morale bombing and that kind of stuff. So it's not perfect, but it's interesting as a historical read if you go into it and you're kind of aware of possible biases and that kind of stuff.
Okay, good to know as I continue reading for 6 months.
Well, you let me know if you agree.
Okay, will do.